Physical Gold Fund presents the Gold Chronicles with Jim Rickards. Insights and analysis about economics, geopolitics, global finance, and gold. Welcome to part 3 of the latest podcast from the Gold Chronicles with Jim Rickards, presented by Physical Gold Fund. As usual, we do have some great questions from our listeners, so here's Alex Tanzik with those questions.
Very good. Thanks a lot, John. And really quickly, just want to take a moment and thank everyone who's been sending in questions. We receive questions for these webinars on a regular basis through email. Some questions also come in on Twitter, and many questions come in live as the webinar progresses. So we appreciate all those that are sent in. As usual, we have far more questions than we have time to answer. We've got about 20 minutes left with Jim, but we will do our best to get some of these pertinent ones answered. And the first one is coming in by email. And Jim, this is referencing your books that you've written, both The Death of Money and Currency Wars. This is coming from Ted G. And the question is, I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit. The question is essentially, you've mentioned in the past that in the next big liquidity crisis, if there's a large financial event, essentially the central banks, it's going to be beyond their ability to bail it out or to create liquidity in that event. And you've indicated that you believe that the IMF will come into play and SDRs will play a large role in salvaging the global economy at that point. The question is essentially, if that is essentially world money or international money, what do people use as currency?
That's a very good question. I'm very much of a global macro analyst, and I do focus on the international monetary system, and that's one of the reasons I talk about the IMF and SDRs is something I have a lot of acquaintance with. I do view that as world money. I do view that as the source of liquidity in a future liquidity crisis when, the Fed printed about $3.5 trillion. They've printed about $3.5 trillion since 2008 in an effort to bail out the economy. Now, I supported QE1. I thought QE1 was an appropriate emergency liquidity response to a liquidity crisis. But that was over by the middle of 2009. QE1 was over and the liquidity crisis was over. By late 2009, we still had unemployment was high and growth was low, and we were struggling out of a recession, and all those things were true. But there was no liquidity crisis. There was no shortage of money, and yet the Fed continued to print money through QE2 and QE3, and I think they've been completely counterproductive and no bang for the buck, except that they bloated the balance sheet. Now, here's the thing. If somehow the Fed had managed to take the balance sheet from over $4 trillion back down to $800 billion, which is where they started. In 2008, when they started all this, their balance sheet was about $800 billion. Today it's well over $4 trillion. If they had managed to get it back to $800 billion, I would say, okay, nice job, that worked. And if we have a liquidity crisis tomorrow, you guys can go print a couple $1 trillion and hand it out and keep the game going. But they haven't. I mean, they got to $4 trillion, and they're still there. They have not normalized the balance sheet. Everyone focuses on interest rates. Well, sure, they haven't normalized interest rates, but they haven't normalized the balance sheet either. So what are they going to do when the next crisis comes? Print another $4 trillion, take the balance sheet to $8 trillion? I mean, legally you can, but I think that they would push through a confidence limit that there would come a time when people just said, okay, this is a joke. Money has lost its meaning, and we're going to get out of the dollar and into alternatives, including hard assets. So that's why I say that when the time comes, this money is going to have to come from the IMF because the IMF does have a greater capacity to create it. But we'll still have dollars, but the dollar will lose its role as the global reserve currency. The dollar will be a local currency, what in Philadelphia we call walking around money. So you and I will still have dollars. You go to the bar, go to a restaurant tonight, you'll pay in dollars. But it's sort of like when I go to Mexico, I buy pesos. When I go to Turkey, I get some Turkish lira. When I go to the Middle East, I get some dinar, dirham. When I go to the UAE, so there are local currencies all over the world, including the Zimbabwe dollar. But nobody thinks that they're reserve currencies. Nobody thinks that you can buy oil using them. Nobody thinks that you can settle your balance of payments. You can't buy oil with pesos, and you can't settle your balance of payments with dirham, you need dollars to do that, or euros. I mean, euros are okay. So, so in the future, what I would expect is that the SDR would be the global reserve currency. Oil would be priced in SDRs. Countries would settle their balance of payments between each other in SDRs. Maybe the financial accounts of the 100 or so largest corporations. So you get a financial report from IBM or Volkswagen or General Electric or someone like that. Maybe it's all presented in SDRs. We'll still have dollars, but the dollar will be a local currency, walking around money, something you need when you come to the United States, but which is not particularly valued as an international medium of exchange. So we're not going to have SDRs in our pockets. There are no SDRs. I mean, there was a retirement party for a very prominent central banker in the 1970s, and Paul Volcker went to a printer, and as a novelty, he had some SDR paper notes printed up, sort of as a gag. But there are no SDR paper notes, and we're not going to have them in our pockets, and we're not going to spend them at the ball game. We'll still have dollars, but you can think of it as sort of Mexican pesos.
Great, and thank you for pointing that out, Jim, because I think that that's really important for people to understand. A lot of people, I think, may not have really understood the difference and were concerned about the whole idea of switching to having to use IMFs, maybe people who don't deal with money on an institutional level. So the next question, if we can switch over to gold for just a moment, we've got a number of different people asking similar questions along the same lines, so we're going to kind of group them together. This question is coming from Fred H. Amongst others, there are other people asking essentially the same question. And it all has to do with gold confiscation. As you're well aware, in the United States history, there was an executive order issued to confiscate gold within the United States. But you have mentioned in the past that you don't feel that this is likely now. So if we can break this into a couple of different segments. First, why don't you think gold confiscation is likely in the U.S.? Do you think it's possible? And then second, that may or may not be true for the EU. And if that's the case, why? And then third, if you don't mind me asking all these questions kind of all at once, as you know, Physical Gold Fund vaults over in Switzerland. And what's your view on Switzerland in light of what might happen over in Europe in terms of gold confiscation?
Okay, start with the U.S. I don't want to be categorical about this. I'm not going to say that confiscation could never happen, but I do think it's extremely unlikely. And the reason is that it's very, very impractical at this stage. First of all, believe it or not that many Americans own gold. I talk about it all the time, and I advise it, and I recommend it, but it's not widely held. We've had 40 years I wouldn't even call it brainwashing. I would call it radio silence. I mean, when I was in graduate school in the 70s in economics, it was shortly after Nixon closed the gold window. But we did not go off the gold standard immediately. What Nixon did in 1971, he ended redemption, kind of like a mutual fund or hedge fund that suspends redemptions. He said, okay, you cannot walk up to the window with dollars and get gold. We're closing the window temporarily, and he did use the word temporarily. Turned out to be permanent, but at the time it looked like a temporary expedient. But technically, we were still on a gold standard for about 3 more years. So it wasn't really until around 1974-75 that after a series of IMF meetings that they officially demonetized gold. Well, that was exactly when I was a graduate student in international economics, and so I actually had to study gold as a monetary asset. But I think I was the last one to do so, or the last class to do so. Since then, for the last 40 years, gold has not been taught. I say if you know anything about gold, you're either self-taught or you went to mining college, because you have to be, fairly, you have to have been around for a while to have been taught gold in an academic context. So it's not even that people are anti-gold, it's just that they don't know anything about it. They think it's for jewelry, and they don't think of it as any form of money. Of course, I think gold is money. So it's not that widely held, not as widely held as it was in 1933. In 1933, you could still take a gold coin. There's a $20 coin. An ounce of gold was worth $20.67 in the beginning of 1933. Now, it's true that beginning really in World War I, most of the gold was sort of hoovered up and turned into 400-ounce bars and put into vaults. So even people who own gold probably had it in those larger quantities, and it pretty much ceased to function as money in your pocket. But it was still legal tender, and you could have a 1-ounce gold coin. It was worth $20, and you could buy pay for dinner or whatever with it. And then that's what ended in 1933 when it was made illegal for U.S. citizens to have gold. But that was at the depths of the Great Depression. The Depression started in 1929. It was the greatest depression in American history. Unemployment was over 20%. Industrial production dropped by about 20%. Stock market dropped 85%. It was there were trade wars all over the world, currency wars, etc. It was a very, very desperate time. Roosevelt was the new president, and people supported him. They were looking for a change. And so when he issued that order, there was not a lot of resistance. There wasn't. Today, I think it would be completely different. Most Americans don't have gold, but those who do probably prize it very much. They have it precisely because they don't completely trust the purchasing power of the dollar. They don't completely trust digital assets and dollar assets. They want some diversification. They want some hard assets. So they're not just casual holders. They're probably pretty committed holders. And I think between, I'll say, talk radio, certain members of Congress, certainly prominent Americans like Ron Paul and others, and I would, include myself, would be, because we're all advocating for gold. There would certainly be a lot of resistance to this. Now, I'm not talking about civil disobedience, but I think the government would really have to think twice. And I do think there are any number of prominent politicians who would stand up and try to prevent that from happening. So I think it's unlikely because I think there'll be a lot more resistance, a lot more practical problems. I mean, what are they going to do? Break down every door in America and see if you've got a vault or open up every safe deposit box in America? I mean, they actually might do that to the safe deposit boxes because the banks control them. So, I recommend private storage. Private secure logistics for gold rather than bank logistics. But I think for all those reasons, there's less trust in government, more sort of willingness to push back, more politicians who might be on your side, public figures, etc. I just don't think it's practical. Now, would they try something tricky like a 90% excess profits tax on gold? Maybe. I don't think you can rule that out. But I don't view that as a reason not to own gold. People say, well, gee, what's the point of owning gold if it goes up a lot? They're just going to throw an excess profits tax on it. What good does it do me? Well, I have two answers to that. Number one, they might not do that. I mean, they might do that, but they might not. So let's not assume that that's a foregone conclusion. But number two, if you see gold going from, right now around $1,200 an ounce, a little bit less, to, $2,000 an ounce, $3,000 an ounce, $4,000 an ounce, which I do expect, there may come a time when things are spinning out of control and are skyrocketing when it makes sense to sell the gold for $5,000, $6,000 an ounce and maybe put that money into some other asset class that's less likely to be confiscated, such as land or something else. But we're a long way from that. So to me, I want to be along for the ride. I want to own the gold. I want to participate in that upside. You can talk about it as gold going up, but I would view it as the dollar imploding and gold retaining its value while the dollar implodes. Because what's really going up? It's the dollar price of gold that's going up. Another way to put that is that every dollar buys you less and less and less gold. So what's really happening is the dollar is collapsing as the dollar price is going up. But I want to be along for that ride. I mean, could there come a time when it gets so extreme that you want to sell the gold and pivot into another asset class? Maybe. I mean, that's something I would watch carefully. But as I say, we're so far away from that today that I want to own the gold today and be along for the ride. Now, for the EU, a lot of the same considerations apply with one big difference. They have a much more acquaintance with fascism than we do in the United States, whether it's Mussolini in Italy or Hitler in Germany or Stalin in Russia or Franco in Spain. You look around, and I regard all of them as fascists. I know they have different labels. Hitler was a Nazi and Stalin was a communist and Franco called himself a nationalist. I understand all that, but if you think of it in political science terms and you try to be, instead of getting involved in name calling, you try to be objective about what kind of societies they were, I would regard all four of them as fascist. And so Europe has a lot more acquaintance with fascism than we do in North America, although maybe we're not that far behind. So they're actually more, for all the socialism that goes on over there, they are a little bit more respectful, I think, of privacy rights. You look at Google. Google's getting a much tougher time in Europe than they are in the United States about privacy and data mining and what they do with your information and all that. So I think in Europe that confiscatory tradition, because it has been so abused in the past, might be less likely to be activated today. So Europe, you might actually be slightly better off. So that would be the first thing I would say. But specifically with regard to Switzerland, Switzerland is my favorite jurisdiction in the world for kind of security and liberty and respect for the rule of law. Now, it's not perfect. Now, for an American doing business in Switzerland, forget it. The Swiss have been bludgeoned by the U.S. government, Treasury in particular, into handing over all records, and of course, U.S. citizens with. As far as I know, you don't have to declare foreign gold accounts. You do have to declare foreign bank accounts, of course. If you have a foreign bank account, you got to say so on your income tax return. But the U.S. has pretty much hoovered up all the Swiss bank records of all U.S. accounts anyway. So if you didn't declare it, good luck to you, because you'll probably get a phone call from the IRS if you haven't already. But for everyone else in the world whose jurisdictions only tax you on what you make in the jurisdiction, bear in mind the U.S. has global tax jurisdiction. Most other countries in the world, in fact, I think every other country in the world, taxes you on what you make in that country. So if you work in Canada, you pay Canadian tax. If you work in France, you pay French tax. But if you work in Monaco, you don't pay French tax. And if you work in the Cayman Islands, you don't pay Canadian tax, even if you're a Canadian citizen. U.S. is different. U.S., you're a U.S. citizen, you're taxed on your worldwide income. Doesn't matter where you make it, where you have it, et cetera. So U.S. citizens are in a little different position. But the Swiss do take this seriously. They have not been invaded successfully for, I know it's over 500 years, might be longer. But the last time somebody tried to invade them, a Swiss force met them on almost like a suicide mission. The Swiss were outnumbered and killed, but they just wanted to prove a point, and they did. And the invading army retreated pretty quickly. And of course, the country's heavily armed. A lot of those mountains that you like to ski on, and they look pretty from the train. Well, guess what? They're hollowed out, and they've got armaments and artillery and communications, command and control stations. It's interesting. Some of the Swiss vaults are buying hollowed out mountains from the Swiss Army and using them as vaults. So some of the expanded capacity in terms of Swiss vaulting is actually inside some of these mountain tunnels and chambers that have been hammered out for defensive purposes. But for all the reasons I mentioned, rule of law, national security, integrity, tradition, liberty, I think Switzerland is probably the best place in the world to store physical wealth. I know a lot of people talk about Singapore. I'm just not a big fan of Singapore. It looks libertarian kind of from the outside, and pretty good rule of law. And I do business in Singapore, but I don't know. It's a little too close to China, a little too under the Chinese thumb, for my comfort, where Switzerland, I would say, isn't under anybody's thumb. So I think the order of the question was interesting, Alex, because you sort of got it in ascending order of security, which is, I would say, the U.S. maybe least secure, EU slightly better, and Switzerland best of all.
Very good. Thank you very much. I think that clarifies a great deal for a lot of people wondering on that topic. So with that pretty much wraps up our conversation with Jim with you today. Appreciate it as always, and I will turn it back over to John.
Well, thank you, Alex. And let me remind our listeners, you can follow Alex Stanczyk on Twitter. Just go to Twitter and type in Alex, then STANCZYK. Great insights and valuable links from Alex to follow there on Twitter. And thank you, Jim Rickards. It's always a pleasure and an education having you with us. Thank you to our listeners for spending time with us today. Of course, you can also follow Jim on Twitter. His handle is @JamesG.Rickards. So goodbye for now, and we look forward to joining you again soon.
You have been listening to The Gold Chronicles with Jim Rickards, presented by Physical Gold Fund. Recordings can be found at physicalgoldfund.com/podcasts. You can register there for news of upcoming interviews with Jim Rickards and other world-class thinkers.